It's a pleasure to welcome you to Towson University for this signature forum today. We thank you for being here and hope that you will enjoy this valuable presentation and learn as much as I have learned. So again, thank you. It's really an honor for me to introduce a transformative leader, a person who is also creative and dynamic, and that is the president of Towson University, Dr. Kim Schatzel. Please join me in welcoming President Schatzel today.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's very much my pleasure to be able to welcome you all here this afternoon to Towson University. Before I start, I always ask this question whenever I'm in front of a large group in the Baltimore or Maryland area, and that is, please raise your hand if you are a Towson alum or a member of your family is currently a Towson student or a Towson alum. Look at that. That's terrific. Give yourselves a hand, please. Well, I was talking to some folks who told me the fact that they hadn't been on campus for quite a few years, and they remarked on how much it's changed. And for many of you that haven't been back, I can tell you the fact that Towson University is now 23,000 students in terms of enrollment. We are the second largest and fastest growing university in the state of Maryland. We also are the largest university in Greater Baltimore, and we're quite proud of the fact that we lend so much to the higher education sector within the state itself. Many of you are teachers, and we are quite proud of the fact that our DNA is around teacher education and teacher preparation. But the university has changed quite a bit since it was founded. Today, we are the largest provider of healthcare professionals within the state. We have the second largest business school, undergraduate business school in the state of Maryland, as well as we provide a vast majority of STEM professions and STEM graduates to the state as well. So we like to say the fact that Towson University, not just because of our alumni, but the ones that are also moving through the pipeline, that Towson University indeed matters to this great state of Maryland. As you saw on campus, did some of you get caught in some of the traffic on York Road with the cones and the cranes? Well, as a president, you'll never hear me apologize for cones and for cranes, because construction tells you the fact that this is a very vital campus, and this is a campus that's growing. Over the next 5 years, we will invest $700 million worth of investment into the facilities of this campus to catch up on the academic space and to be able to invest in world-class facilities, both for teaching and for research. That $700 million is more than has been invested in this physical plant in the last 20 years. So if you came to campus today and hadn't been here in a while and you said, boy, it had changed, I got to invite you to please come back in 5 years, because you haven't seen anything yet. So again, it's my pleasure to welcome you today. And it is also my pleasure to be able to introduce Dr. Nancy Grasmick. We're very, very fortunate to be able to offer this forum that she is sponsoring. And as we all know, she's internationally known as the former superintendent of Maryland Public Schools. And I'm proud to say that Nancy was the first female that served in that position, and she's the longest serving superintendent as well. And over her 20 years in service, the Maryland public school system, which had almost 900,000 students and almost 1,800 schools, was ranked 4 years straight as the #1 school system in the country. And it just is a testament to her excellence. Yes. In 2012, Dr. Grasmick was appointed a presidential scholar here at Towson University for innovation in teacher and leader preparation. And I'm very, very pleased to also say that she serves on my board of visitors, and she's also chairing our Ed Policies Committee, which is part of the board of visitors. So we're looking for her leadership there. In addition, she's inspiring and also leading in our Women's in Leadership program that we have on campus for our faculty and staff to participate in. So just across the board, Nancy, I don't know where you get the energy, but I'm just glad that you're giving it back to our community. So with that, I'd like to have Nancy come forward, and it's my pleasure to be able to introduce her to all of you. Dr. Nancy Grasmick.
So all of us in this room today are conscious of hearing discussions, conversations, concerns regarding the implications of trauma and, to a lesser extent, stress. And we're particularly concerned about that as we think of our children, our adolescents, and what are the long-term implications of serious trauma and stress. But have we really understood what are not only the implications, but when we look at this on a longitudinal basis, as it not only impacts employment, crime, inability to establish positive relationships. We are interested in this topic for all of us who deal with human beings who may be categorized in this way. And so today, we're extremely fortunate to have someone who really has an international reputation in this area, Dr. Bethany Brand. She is the Martha Minton Professor of Psychology here at Towson University. In terms of her background and her extensive clinical experience, she's been a psychological assessment individual who's had an externship at Johns Hopkins Hospital. She's had a clinical internship at George Washington University Hospital and 2 years of trauma-focused work as a postdoctoral fellow at Shepherd Pratt Health System's Trauma Disorders Program. She does a lot of research on the assessment and treatment of trauma-related disorders, including the assessment of dissociative disorders, and she presents around the world on that topic. She's a principal investigator of an international prospective study of the impact of an online educational program for dissociative disorder patients and their therapists. She's the associate editor of the International Journal of Trauma and Dissociation. And she has served on 3 international task forces that have developed the guidelines for the assessment and treatment of trauma-related disorders. And she regularly serves as a forensic expert in trauma-related cases, which include both federal cases and capital death penalty cases. And she's currently serving as an expert witness in a Supreme Court case in Australia. Now, I mention all of this because I think sometimes we try to minimize what it takes to really understand this whole area of stress and trauma. Here we have a person who has a deep, deep knowledge of the issues. And she also has a private practice where she treats patients. So will you please join me in welcoming, and we're eager to hear from her, Dr. Bethany Brand.
Thank you, Nancy. That's so nice. That's so nice. Thank you. Well, thank you for that very warm welcome and for the invitation to come and present here. It's such an honor to be able to be at Towson. I actually see so many faces I know, students and colleagues and all sorts of people. Hello, students. So a lot of times when I present, it's somewhere else other than Towson, so it's great to be here. So thank you for the invitation. Let's start with thinking about what do I mean by trauma. When I was a psych testing extern at Hopkins University in 1987, it was Hopkins Hospital, I asked my supervisor at that point, and obviously Hopkins had an incredible reputation back then for the students who were young at that point, or maybe not born. I asked my supervisor, how would all these kids who've been traumatized be impacted? And how would their psych testing be different from people who had not, the kids, who had not been traumatized? It was 1987, and she had no idea. What year, this is for the students, what year did post-traumatic stress disorder get added to the Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders? Anybody? Psychology nerds? Take a guess? Go ahead, Jasmine. 1980, a little bit earlier. But the point is that that's still very recent. For us to be adding a diagnostic category, it means that we didn't know enough about it to even give it a name before that. And so in my training, early on, none of my professors knew anything about it. Hopkins didn't know much about it. And so I became really curious about it early on. So the field of trauma came out of what we were learning about in World War I and World War II for the most part. And I call this talk Fight, Flight, or Freeze. How many of you have heard of fight or flight? Raise your hands. And how about freeze? Keep your hands up if you've heard of freeze. So many fewer have heard about freeze. By the end of today, I hope to change that, because it's another trauma reaction that people often don't recognize. Okay, so we knew in the beginning about World War I, World War II, but now we're seeing with school violence and all kinds of, terrorism, all kinds of trauma that's hitting closer to home. We're starting to understand it as a society much more. When I first came to Towson 19 years ago, and I would talk about trauma, students were always interested, yay students, but society at large really wasn't so much so. We just didn't realize how prevalent trauma is. So now it's kind of a hot topic in a tragic way, that it has to be a hot topic, but at least now we're getting some attention. So I'm going to tell you a story about a horrific motor vehicle accident that was obviously many, many, many cars and semis were involved in this thing. A place up in Canada, and it was a horrible night where it was all fogged in and you couldn't see literally as far as your hand. And so all these cars and semis piled into each other. There were many deaths. There were several deaths. And husband and wife were trapped in their car, could not get out because they were so pinned in by the cars around them. Actually, trauma warning. I'm going to talk, I won't get very graphic, but this next little bit is pretty graphic. In case anybody wants to just tune me out for a minute, you can. They witnessed a teenage girl burned to death in the car ahead of them. She couldn't get out of her car either. She was trapped. And so the husband, both were absolutely terrorized, husband and wife. The husband stayed frantic but behaviorally active. He could move. And he was frantically trying to get them out of the car. The wife went into a frozen state where she could not move. If her husband hadn't been in that car, she would have burned to death, just like the girl ahead of her. The husband found a way to break out the windshield and literally had to drag his wife to safety, and they both survived. Of course, they had horrific PTSD, of course. I mean, that's just a given when you go through something like this. And then they were incredibly brave and volunteered to go. A friend and colleague, co-author of mine, Ruth Lanius, is a MD, PhD researcher up in London, Ontario. She got them to agree to come into her lab. She studies what the brain does in response to trauma. And they went into an fMRI machine after they had told her the story of their traumas. So she read back the story of the car accident to them, each one at a time while they're in the scanner, to watch what their brain does. Obviously, while you're in the middle of a car accident like this, you can't have anybody scanning your brain. But that methodology is the closest we can get to figuring out what's going on in a brain during trauma. And so she watched what both the husband's brain did and then later what the wife's brain did while they listened to their trauma stories. And this was really cutting edge, very hot research when this came out. I was at a conference, it was by invitation only for trauma experts down at USHUS in DC, Uniform Healthcare Sciences. I'm sorry, I'm not getting the name exactly right. And she was presenting this data to an auditorium filled to capacity with trauma experts from around the world. And when she showed the next couple of slides, there were audible gasps through the audience. Trauma experts didn't know what she figured out. So this is the husband's brain, and where you see areas of light is essentially where there's a lot of blood being used, which means that those brain regions are activated. And so what we see here is that his brain was really activated. He was able to be thinking and talking and putting things into words and moving, planning ahead with the prefrontal cortex still lit up. His brain was still alert and on. Remember, he stayed behaviorally active. This is his wife's brain. Almost nothing stayed on. Her brain was just shutting down. Fight, flight, or freeze. She was frozen in terror. Her brain shut off, more or less, metaphorically, in terror. So they both went, and so this is the one that gasped. Everybody knew what the first brain was going to look like, but no, these experts didn't know dissociation. This is dissociation, and I'll talk more about it and define it in a few minutes. They didn't realize, as much as they knew about trauma and had been studying it for their whole careers probably, they didn't know that people could freeze and their brains would do this when they were frozen in utter terror. So how could it be that two people could go through the exact same trauma and have massively different reactions to it? Anybody want to guess? And not any of you students who've seen this slide before can't raise your hand. Any guesses? Why did the wife's brain shut down and the husband's did not? Yes? In a way. Okay, and the question is why? Why was he able to keep his brain activated? The wife had had earlier childhood trauma. She had gone through childhood trauma where she had a mother that was a very conflicted relationship, very difficult, probably some emotional abuse, and she had learned to shut down her brain, shut down her feelings, and dissociate often. She also had a very close relationship with her father, who tragically died, and so that attachment relationship was gone. That's a source of resiliency, and so she was left on her own. So she had learned to habitually dissociate under extreme stress. Not extreme, I mean, I hear much more graphic, horrible stories of childhood physical and sexual abuse. But nonetheless, it had been a traumatic childhood without safe attachment throughout the entire childhood. So she had learned to dissociate under stress. The husband had had a healthy upbringing, good, solid attachment. He didn't need to learn how to dissociate in childhood. And so his brain stayed on. This has massive impact for teachers, for parents, for us in neighborhoods, for all of us, those of us who want to be therapists, those of us who are therapists. We need to understand that these are different adaptations to trauma and figure out how to work with individuals who've been traumatized. All right, let's keep going. The effects of trauma can last for a lifetime. One of the things that I hear most often from clients is their friends and loved ones will tell them if it's childhood abuse that they experienced, that stuff was decades ago. Put it behind you, forget about it, don't dwell on it, move on. They would love to, if only they could. The impact of trauma can be enduring so that you can't just say, it's all said and done. The woman would have burned to death in the car. Do you think she wanted to be impacted by her childhood trauma? Of course not. Survival would have gotten her out of that car if she could have. So we need to understand the impact. Steve Sharfstein, the former president and CEO at Shepherd Pratt Health System, said that what smoking is to cancer, trauma is to psychiatric problems. So we know that cancer just opens us up to a raft of all kinds of medical problems. Trauma does the same for a raft of psychiatric problems that begin in childhood, can continue through adolescence, as well as into adulthood. And I'm going to show you some data. It's not my data. I do, as Dr. Grasmick was saying, I specialize in dissociative disorders. Toward the end of the talk, I'm going to talk much more often about dissociation. But most of this talk I'm going to be talking about working with, about children directly, and I work with adults at this point. Okay, so how common is child abuse? Well, let's drop down here first. 1 in 8 kids in the U.S. experiences childhood emotional, physical, or sexual abuse, often more than one. I'll show you some data that shows that if exposed to one type of childhood abuse, kids are much more at risk for other types of childhood abuse too. So childhood trauma tends to come in clusters. Also, 1,000 to 2,000 children each year in the U.S. die due to abuse or neglect. That's twice the rate of many European countries. We have a very serious problem with childhood abuse and neglect in the U.S. So now I'm going to shift gears a bit. I've talked so far about childhood abuse, and when I say that, I really do mean childhood physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. There's also neglect, so that broadens it to maltreatment. So neglect, like not feeding your child enough when they're very medically ill, not getting them medical attention, for example, leaving a very young child at home alone to take care of themselves and the parent leaving for hours at a time. Those are examples of what could be considered neglect. I'm going to now talk about a series of studies called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale, and it's abbreviated ACE, the ACE studies. It started out as a collaboration between experts from the Center for Disease Control and a collaboration with Kaiser Permanente in California. And so they had this massive sample size of 17,000 plus people. And when you do a study that big, you can really find out some amazing things. Since this study, which has had such an impact on the mental health field that these two investigators, Folletti and Anda, have been asked to present their research to Congress. So it was that level of cutting edge research. So Folletti and Anda get et al. Get the credit for starting the ACE studies, but since then it's been replicated by all kinds of researchers around the world, and they're finding very consistent patterns. So these are the pioneers, but it's been replicated again and again. So the ACEs for this study, sometimes it's defined a little differently, but for the data I'm going to show you, there are 8 ACEs that they looked at. So yes, the 3 forms of actual abuse, but also these stressors. Witnessing domestic violence between their caregivers, significant parental discord where there's screaming, fighting, name-calling, that kind of fighting. Growing up with somebody in your household who has a mental illness, had a mental illness, growing up with somebody in the household who abused substances, and growing up with somebody who had been in prison or was in prison. What you do to get somebody's ACE score is you just add up how many of these type of experiences they had, and so they can get anywhere from 0 to 8 ACEs. When I do the death penalty casework, the mitigation kind of work, I'm usually hired by defense teams, many of the folks I've worked with have 7 or 8 ACEs. They've experienced all of this stuff. And so when you think about what creates somebody who might potentially become extraordinarily aggressive and maybe even a murderer, well, these, at the worst, it could be a early life history just filled with this kind of stress and trauma, and we'll talk about why that might be. All right, to give you a sense, you can read this quicker than I can read it to you. These are the questions that they asked specifically about emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. So this was not mild abuse. This was really overt abuse. Oops, let's go back. Okay, so you add up the number of ACEs somebody experiences, and this is how common the ACEs are. 64% of the respondents had at least one ACE, which means that most of the children in America have experienced one ACE. And then they found something called a dose response, which means, I'll say it in words and I'll show you in pictures, that if you've got no ACEs, your risk for something is down here. If you've got 1, it's here. If you've got 2, it's here. It's additive. The more ACEs you have, there's like this stair-step effect where the results again and again across this research team and this sample, but then replicated by all kinds of researchers, shows that ACEs early in childhood have a damaging impact potentially across the lifespan into somebody's senior years. All right, so this is the beginning of this stair step. So I'm going to start with mental health problems and then look at panic. So this column are people who had no ACEs, 1, 2, 3, and 4 or greater. In the sample, you get a lot of people who had 4 or greater, but what I want you to see is that every single slide I'm going to show you for a while, it's the group that has a lot of ACEs. These are the kids that are in particular trouble. These are the kids who end up in the foster care system, or at least they're at high risk to end up in foster care, to end up in criminal justice, special education, and eventually in the mental health system. And when they tend to get in the mental health system, it's not for 5 months. It's on and off throughout their lives. So this is a group in particular, I feel like we as a society need to learn how to help. And while I'm thinking of it, and my students know my style of teaching, I just go with what's hot on the brain at the moment. Just a little thought about the treatment of trauma. Most of the trauma treatment studies that have been done don't look at the most traumatized people. They get inadvertently, or I'm sure researchers aren't doing this stuff on purpose, but they get excluded from the studies because this group, as you're going to see, they tend to have panic and depression, very high levels of anxiety, and sometimes even the psychotic symptoms of hallucinations, hearing and seeing things that aren't really there. We don't think about psychosis as related to trauma exposure, but yes, it is. It's not directly caused by it, but it elevates your risk for it. Same with bipolar disorder, same with most of the diagnoses in the DSM. With the studies that have been done so far, it comes up again and again. Sleep disturbances too, look at that. Think about how are these kids going to be in class? If they can't sleep at night, how are you? When you can't sleep, how good is your concentration, your mood, your peer relationships? Can you tolerate anger and frustration very well the next day? And if you're an adult sitting in this room, which everybody is, your brain's myelinated fully for those who are beyond 25. Got as much myelin up there as you're going to get. But these kids don't. They don't have the kind of braking system that the adults do. I know myself, I'm a good mom, I'm not abusive, but I'm not as patient when I'm not sleeping well, or midterms or finals, or I've got a big presentation. So my point here is that these are some kids who are going to be potentially difficult in the classroom. And the teachers aren't going to know why. So I'm beginning to give you some hints about where I'm going with some of this. These are kids where it may be easy to dislike them. They may not be liked by teachers because some of them are going to be difficult kids who act out. They can't sit still. They can't pay attention, potentially. Some kind of fall through the cracks, and they do what in psychology we call internalizing disorders. They're depressed, they're anxious, they shut down, they don't cause anybody problems. But others externalize and they act it out more. These are also kids who've had a lot of ACEs are more at risk for obesity and all kinds of medical complaints. Headaches, stomach aches, it's not all faked. They really have these things, and it continues into adulthood. A lot of my clients, I obviously specialize in very traumatized people, a lot of them have numerous medical problems. They're at higher risk for smoking and smoking early, alcoholism, all kinds of illicit drug use, and even IV drug use. This is the impact of ACEs. These are the ills in our society. This is what's driving the cost of our medical system. Early intercourse, having more than 30 sex partners, sexual dissatisfaction, having problems remembering their childhood, remembering possibly the trauma, and having a lot of stress, feeling stressed often later in life. They've also got problems potentially with anger. Although obviously that tends to be more manifest by boys than girls in our society, men versus women, but difficulty controlling anger, and these folks are at much higher risk for later violent relationships, both as victims and as perpetrators. Okay? These folks are at risk for, these kids are at risk for having very difficult later lives. Very, very difficult. And these are the folks that if we could identify them early and prevent some of this and get them and their families help early, think about the cost savings. I mean, cost in terms of emotional suffering, academic, loss of achievement, their future careers being decimated, all kinds of ways it could save them as well as society money and suffering. So why is it that the severe repeated childhood trauma causes so many problems later in life? It's because it changes the brain, amongst other things. I could go on and on, as my students know, about this. I'm going to limit myself to this 1 hour, but let me just dabble a little bit in some of the changes in the brain. All right, high stress causes an impaired brain. Even for the adults, we know this. When we're really stressed, you sometimes can't think clearly, you can't stay organized, you can't plan very well. Well, the same thing happens for kids. They can't focus attention, they can't think logically, and they can't remember. They're not able to settle down enough that their brain can actually remember. Again, how are teachers going to feel about these kids? They're going to look like they don't care. They're sleeping in class. They may be disheveled. If they haven't eaten, they may even be more agitated or disruptive. So kids aren't going to say, I was abused last night, and that's why I'm such a pain in the butt today. You know, so it's just something for us to be thinking about. What happened to you? Instead of what's wrong with you, what happened to you? What happened last night? What's going on in your life? Anyway, as kids are exposed again and again and again to very high levels of stress and or abuse, over time they develop this conditioned response, like the wife in the car whose brain dissociated. She dissociated. Her brain shut down. Again and again, if that happens, it may take less of the stimuli, less danger may trigger dissociation. So that over time, for example, with dissociative disorders, if they just feel like there's a little bit of anger in the room, maybe somebody's a little angry, they may already be dissociating even when they're not at risk. If the teacher in class looks a little bit ticked off, well, they know what mom or dad or whoever has the problems with anger management, they know what happens then. And so their brain just automatically, without them wanting it to, starts shutting off. And so they look inattentive, they look like they don't care, but in fact, it's an adaptation to trauma. It's a conditioned stress response. I try and explain this stuff to juries when they're wanting to put somebody to death who's had 7 or 8 or 9, or some scales look at 10 ACEs. All right, let's talk about the prefrontal cortex. That's this part of our brain. That's the part of our brain that's it's responsible for so many very, very important things. Abstract thinking, sequential ordering of events, planning ahead, impulse control, all kinds of things that you need to have online if you're going to succeed in school and in the world, basically. The prefrontal cortex under high stress is extremely impaired. There's basically these stress chemicals that start shutting down the functioning of the prefrontal cortex, and that means that these older primitive parts of our brain, you've probably heard about the reptilian brain or the crocodile brain, that's the part of the brain that may start taking over. And so when we're in that state, including kids, when we're in that state of extreme stress, we can't control our attention, we can't focus on what the teacher's saying, we can't focus on our homework, we can't remember, we can't think logically. And what begins to happen is, I'm talking metaphorically here, this part of the brain hijacks the smart part of the brain. And I've heard it said that essentially you lose, metaphorically, 30 or 40 IQ points. You suddenly become really stupid, and you do really stupid things. And that means that we start going to reflexes, habits. So, for example, in more serious cases, kids, when they're overwhelmed with emotion, they may start cutting themselves. Kids learn to cut, I mean like cutting themselves with razors or whatnot, because it releases emotion, it releases endorphins, it can calm them down. It can do all kinds of things, but that's some of the things that it does. And so they may cut. Others of us may drink. Others of us go to bed and sleep way too much when we're overwhelmed. We all have these less than healthy coping skills or habits. If you grow up in a really dysfunctional family, particularly in a really rough neighborhood where it's not even safe to go outside and go socialize with other kids, you're left to your own devices. They're not going to be healthy ones for these kids, chances are. And you think about the adaptive origins of this. The crocodile brain, the reptilian brain, responds in nanoseconds. This part of the brain takes a little longer. So you know, the people who lived, our ancestors who lived out in wild areas with wild animals, those who sat around and thought and planned it out as the bear was running after them, they were eaten. They didn't survive. It's actually survival. It helps in most cases in survival, except for modern day, in most cases. It helps that you don't have to think. You just go to your habits. Unless you're in a school setting and the door slamming or a kid, you know, suddenly yelling at the teacher or whatever. It's not really life-threatening, but your brain thinks it is. All right, here's some other, there's many, many more changes in this in the brain. It literally changes hardwiring and structures in the brain to be exposed repeatedly to stress. The part of our brain that's responsible for helping with memory tends to be smaller hippocampus. The corpus callosum, this band that connects the two hemispheres so they can communicate and work in an organized way together, tends to be smaller. And the prefrontal cortex, the part that we need to help us control ourselves and think things through and have empathy and all kinds of important human characteristics, is not as developed. These kids already had it rough. They're going to have it rougher because their brains are different. They have heightened reactivity. A client of mine, she's got the most severe form of dissociative disorder, which I'll come back to, but it used to be called multiple personality disorder. It's now called dissociative identity disorder. I've been seeing her weekly. She knows me. She knows my waiting room. She knows my office. When I come in the door, if she's looking down and just unlocking or opening the door, just the noise can make her jump an inch or two. And she never habituates to the sound. She can't. Her nervous system is so jacked up. So that's a really serious kind of heightened reactivity. Amazingly enough, she managed to get an advanced degree and is functioning. She's not on disability. But it's not that way for many people who have as many ACEs as she has. And there's different patterns of brain activation. So here I wanted you to see, this is a kid, two kids who are one normal control that was not abused, not neglected, and this child was very seriously neglected early in life. And you can see it. You don't have to be a researcher to see the difference in those two corpus callosums. You can see that impact is going to be significant. For anybody who's really interested in reading some of the top-notch researchers in the field who look at neurobiology, Teicher and Lanius are both really good names to look for. So I had talked about patterns of brain activation. This study, this is Lanius, if you're curious how to spell her name. A group of us, I contributed to this article, but I don't get the credit, Lanius does. We summarized the literature to date at that point, looking at regular PTSD in the scanner, and then looking at people who dissociate in the fMRI scanner. And we saw very different patterns of activation. The amygdala is the part of the brain that responds to real danger, so with anger and terror. And in regular PTSD, when they were hearing their trauma stories, their amygdala turned on. They got impulsive, angry, terrified. When people were dissociated in the scanners, their amygdalas tended to shut down, and the prefrontal, different parts of the prefrontal cortex got overactive. So I think of the prefrontal cortex, this is very simplified, but that's like the braking system for the emotional reactive parts of the brain. This is also the part of the brain that knows and can tag how we're feeling. It can monitor what's going on inside our bodies. If people are highly dissociative, they sometimes literally can't feel pain in their bodies. It's an adaptive response. A friend of mine who's actually in this audience right now, she was in a horrible car accident. I hope she's okay with me sharing this story. Her car flipped. She was upside down on the DC Beltway, and she thought to herself, I can move my toes. I'm okay. But she'd actually suffered a head trauma, and she wasn't okay. And she had a long recovery period. But she wasn't fully aware, probably. She was in somewhat of a dissociated state. And it's adaptive, if you think about it, to not feel pain when you're in pain, because you can still function and move. So it was probably adaptive. So I'm not trying to say that dissociation is always maladaptive. It's not. If a little kid is being horrifically sexually abused or physically abused, and they cannot run away, because that's their babysitter or their caretaker or their neighbor or their minister or their priest, they can't escape. What can they do? They can go away in their heads. They can imagine that they're actually not there. That's dissociation. But before we get too far into that, let's come back to what is executive functioning. It's the part of it's jobs, these are all prefrontal cortex jobs. Impulse control, decision-making, judgment, emotion regulation, managing transitions like between classes, putting away the book, starting out the next subject, keeping organized, planning ahead, homework, school projects, focusing attention, paying attention in class. For example, your working memory, what you're able to remember and kind of keep in mind as you're doing, like, let's say, mental math. And there's many, many more functions than that. All of these forms of executive functioning can be dampened and impaired by stress and trauma. So I know I'm repeating somewhat. I'm doing this on purpose because we have to hear it a couple of times. So the brain becomes highly sensitized to threat. Are there any first responders in the audience? A few. Good. Thank you for being here. So you may see people who are not actually in so much danger sometimes, but in a crisis situation, their brains are all jacked up and they feel like they're being terribly threatened, when in fact they're not. Sometimes, of course, you go to scenes where there really is some very, very serious danger. But a traumatized brain can overinterpret threat and see it when there's actually not threat. Like that client of mine who jumped so much in the office. It's just me coming back from the bathroom. Not going to hurt her. But her brain doesn't know that. The survival part of her brain's trying to keep her alive and to watch for the bad guys who hurt her in childhood. So they're easily triggered. They can't think and feel at the same time, which is dangerous. You need to be able to think and feel empathy and connection with others, or sometimes you don't do very well in your relationships. Sometimes they do some amazing reenactments of trauma. They can be violent to others, self-harmful, suicidal, impulsive, and they can actually feel tremendously helpless even when they're not, but they feel helpless and so they act helpless. And so therapists or loved ones need to try and help them find some ways to stay in control. Or these might be the kids, for example, who are acting out and mouthing off to authority figures all the time, because they can't at home. They've got all this rage bottled up and helplessness from home, and so they just spew it when they're in other contexts. All right, so these kids end up with a lot of dissociation, disconnection. I'll talk some more about it. Poor decision making, really dumb thinking. What were you thinking? They weren't thinking. Prefrontal cortex offline. And they may feel so hopeless about their future, they don't even think they have a future career. What is the point of studying and doing well in school if you don't think you're going to make it into your 20s? There's research that show that a lot of very traumatized kids don't think, especially if they're coming from settings of urban violence, they don't think they're going to make it into their 20s. So what's the point? Live for today. They often end up in relationships with all kinds of mistrust and, as I've said, being victimizers or victims themselves. And they can get excluded socially because they may look a little out of step, and their peers, kids are incredibly adept at picking up psychological problems in other kids, and they can be cruel as heck, as I'm sure most of us remember. All right, just because of time, I'm going to speed up just a little bit here. Frank Putnam, who's one of my heroes, he's one of the legends in the trauma field. And I was incredibly fortunate enough to study my master's with him, and now he collaborates with me on some treatment outcome research. He and a group have made some slides, which it's on my list of resources. You can go to his website, and they want to give away information about trauma and have educators and others use it free, download of PowerPoint slides. So this is one of his slides that he is very happy to share. So it shows the cost of maltreatment in a single cohort, kids who were victimized in 2014, and then working with healthcare economists, they moved forward and projected using all kinds of sophisticated statistics to try and predict over the course of their lifetime, what would one cohort of traumatized kids end up costing America? And the answer is $5.9 trillion. 1 year's worth. If we could change that, you think about the money that would be available for education, for improving all kinds of infrastructure, all kinds of programs. All right, now let's get more into dissociation. So remember I talked about if you can't escape from your caregiver or whoever your abuser is when you're a little kid, you can go away in your mind. When there is no outward physical escape, there's mental escape. So fight, flight, or freeze, like the woman did in the car, that's dissociation. She disconnected from her body, even though she didn't want to. She could not move. And that tends to happen. It can happen from a one-time trauma. It can. People just can numb out and freeze. But it's much more common if they've been exposed to lots and lots of trauma over time, especially in childhood. You know, if you use parts of the brain or muscles, the more you use them, the more they develop. It's that way with brain networks. So if a brain network is used again and again and again and again, it just gets interconnected, more neurons develop, and that part of the brain, those networks can get turned on faster and stronger. And so they develop these stress response reactions that can take over in nanoseconds. The artwork I'm going to show you is from a former Towson student. Her name is Rachel Elise, and she gives me permission to share her artwork. If you Google Rachel Elise, you can get to her website. She has dissociative identity disorder, and she uses her artwork, amongst other things, to try and help educate people about the impact of trauma, and some of them are to show you what dissociation and dissociative identity disorder feel like to her. So she's trying to show here, and just out of curiosity, just for some information, she is a woman. She's a Caucasian woman. And she's not my patient. I couldn't show my own patient's artwork. But she shows at some level that this part of her, my guess is this is a part of her, that's been a traumatized, terribly shamed, horrified, just shut down part of her with all the emotions and perhaps the memory of what happened. And a shell of her arises, a fragment of who she was, a shadow of who she was without all that feeling. And she can walk away, which is good. She's not dead because of what happened. She did survive, but she walks away without emotion. You can imagine, how is it to live a life without emotion? Or at least this part of her is living without emotion. So dissociation is a very complex construct. I'm just going to emphasize a few parts of it. When you know or somebody knows they should have emotional reactions to something really powerful and yet they're numb, that's dissociation, but a milder version. When you're driving around the Beltway and you're not crashing and you're not drunk, but you don't remember your exit and you just go right past it, that's dissociation. That's automatism. We can all do that, and that's perfectly normal, non-pathological dissociation. But some of these are obviously becoming more serious. You should be able to remember what you do. You're not going to remember all of this lecture, but hopefully later tonight you'll remember you were here. If you had dissociative identity disorder and you had a different state present here for this talk, you might not remember the talk, okay? You might have like a gap in your memory. All of us have different states. Like right now, the state that I'm in is not the way I am. It's not the state that I am when my kids were infants and I, do babble with them, or when I talk to my cat. I'm in different states. We all have different states like that. If we don't have dissociative identity disorder, we have more or less control over our states, unless maybe you have panic disorder. That's a sudden shift in anxiety and state. Or if you have bipolar disorder, lows and highs, you may not be able to control those states. So all of us have different states, some less control than others. With DID, you don't have all the control over different states, and you have amnesia for what you do in some states. So the media does horrible things when they portray DID, dissociative identity disorder. It's stereotypes, it's wrong, makes my head spin like The Exorcist. My students have seen it, they will vouch for it. She goes nuts. Anyway, I specialize in that disorder, and I really take offense to some of the movies out there and how they portray it. Somebody can dissociate when they're in class, let's say, and they're trying desperately to pay attention to algebra, and all of a sudden what the parents screamed at them the night before comes back in their minds. Or the smell of the alcohol and the person who sexually assaulted them comes back to mind. Those are intrusive thoughts and completely disruptive to their current focus. So that's a type of dissociation. And behavior, I was involved in a murder trial here in Maryland where, just very briefly, a grandmother was told by her 4-year-old grandson that he was being sexually abused, and she tried to protect him in all the legal routes, the Department of Social Service reports. DSS repeatedly investigated, didn't find abuse, and didn't stop it, and the boy was incredibly, he would lose control of his bowels when it was time for him to go to that person's house where he was supposed to go. And so the grandmother, who had been abused herself, and her own father had been shot in front of their house in his car at point-blank range by somebody sitting in the back seat. She was 2. That had happened to her. She had never received trauma treatment. She got, at the drop-off point when she's supposed to be handing off the grandson for the next visitation person, she got in the back seat of the car and she shot the person at point-blank range. And she had no conscious awareness that she was reenacting what happened to her father. She was in a dissociated state. And I had to explain that to the jury, that she wasn't consciously thinking it through and she couldn't remember it. But she clearly did it. She clearly did. It was on video cameras from the fast food chain. So there's some really very serious behavioral reenactments that can occur. All right. Dissociation helps kids going through so many ACEs survive it because they don't have to always feel the pain. They don't always have to remember these horrible memories when they're at school. So it can be protective. But over time, if you're living without emotions, if that happens again and again and again, life can start to feel very flat. They're at very high risk for depression. And their relationships tend not to be very healthy. And they may make bad choices. Think about sometimes if you're thinking about doing something wrong, hopefully you feel guilty in advance, you get anxious. But what if you're so dissociated you don't feel that? Our emotions actually they help us stay safe and make good choices. But these kids may not have access to that. So those are just some of the ways they can be problematic. All right, I've said enough of that. I'm going to keep going. So this again is artwork from Rachel Elise. And she's showing what it feels like to her, contrary to what the movies show, where suddenly, Sybil, Sally Fields is dressed in a peacock blue suit, speaking in a French accent, and then next she's, a little kid sucking her thumb underneath the therapist's chair. I mean, those kind of extreme variations can occur, but mostly the reality of what it really looks like is that somebody's shifting moods. As a therapist, that's what it looks like when a person shifts states with this disorder in my office. So to friends, loved ones, teachers, these are going to look like kids who are moody, who may not remember what was just going on before they shifted mood. That's what it looks like. Or they can also be dazed. I'm going to imitate this. This is always embarrassing to do in front of top administrators at your university. Okay, so I'm sitting here, and now I'm starting to dissociate. Boy, isn't this fun. So tell me what I'm doing. Besides making Dr. Chandler wonder about signing my contract again. I'm stilling. Behaviorally, I'm holding still. I stop making eye contact. I'm trying to make my eyes glaze, which is very hard to do when everybody's staring at you. And my voice becomes monotone. My face becomes sort of lack of musculature change. I just hold still and freeze. We've all done a little bit of that when you're supposed to be reading your assignments or grading, for those professors out there, and you're staring at something and your eyes glaze and the writing, you can't read it after a bit. That's light dissociation. So we all dissociate in and out a little bit. All right. Rachel Elise apparently feels like she has a male state. Think about how that might be adaptive. A little girl being sexually abused, and instead of having just being a scared little girl, maybe she feels like she's got a man. Sometimes she can be a male who's adult and big. Maybe that felt protective to her. I don't know, she's not my patient, but that's a possibility. Okay, now I'm going to shift gears and talk about how we can help. Now that you have some pretty good ideas about the enduring impact of trauma, including dissociation and how it literally can be life-threatening as well as life-saving. During trauma, it can be life-saving, but later it could put these kids and adults at extreme risk. Let's talk about how we can help. So depending on what your role is with the person who's been traumatized, it's really important, first of all, that we have knowledge about trauma and its impact, and that it's not something you can just wish away. You can't just make yourself stop jumping when the therapist walks in the room. When I get stressed, keep my wits about me. So learning about it and then teaching people who've been traumatized about it is incredibly important. So that's why a group, Ruth Lanius and I and Frank Putnam and a bunch of other people have created this online intervention. We made 45 videos where we show 10-minute to 15-minute increments, and I'm just talking on each of these videos, telling the people who are going to be watching the videos, therapists and DID patients, about the impact of trauma, why people who are severely traumatized tend to be so self-destructive, and then step by step we take them through over the course of 2 years, teaching them how to deal with their emotions, how to deal with stress in healthy ways, and if they have full-blown personality states, how to work with them rather than be at war. All of that's all education and online. Okay, so we need to know that kids are dissociating and what it looks like. So this may be a kid who's inattentive and doing that staring thing. My first year at Towson, I was asked by the Baltimore Psychological Association to do a talk about trauma. And so I imitated just what I did here, essentially, but I was a first-year professor. And a former psychology professor was in the audience, and he saw me do that impression. And then literally, later that fall, a grad student came in, a grad student who was normally active and talkative in class, and she was so emotionally shut down, and she talked like this. He thought she was in a psychotic state. She was so different than normal and so disconnected. And she basically had to tell him that she was having a psychiatric crisis. She eventually revealed to him that she had full-blown dissociative identity disorder. He was a psych professor, and he didn't know, and he didn't remember how I had imitated what dissociation looks like. So try and get your brain to remember what dissociation looks like. It's just like kind of trancing out that glassy-eyed look. That's one of the ways it can look. It's complex. Okay, when kids are really putting themselves down or out and out hurting themselves, you want to understand that could be the impact of overwhelming stress and trauma. If they're isolating themselves, pushing others away, mistrusting you and authority figures, everybody in general, perhaps there's something going on in their lives that's really frightening to them. And some kids and adults will deny trauma, even if it's known, even if so many examples come to mind, but I won't share just because of time. They may deny it or minimize its impact. It's very common for people to say, I know people who had it so much worse. It's a defense, you know? You can only let that kind of pain in so fast. So if we understand about trauma's impact and if we can show encouragement, so show respect to whoever it is who's been traumatized, including if it's yourself. You probably have some degree of self-loathing, self-blame, self-hatred, lack of self-compassion. Work on it. That's my assignment to you. I am so obnoxious. You can work on developing self-respect and believing in yourself and forgiving yourself whatever happened in childhood. Kids can't control adults. They just can't. Help kids or other traumatized people develop safe connections. One of the reasons why trauma treatment is so helpful is because with the therapist, they can develop a safe connection where it's safe to talk about feelings and vulnerable things like that. And I'm not suggesting that teachers get kids to talk all about trauma at school. That's not helpful. But a relationship where somebody, like a teacher, believes in them and talks to them and encourages them. That is incredibly helpful. For my dissertation, with my professor and another grad student, we interviewed 100 women who had grown up in households where somebody in the household was sexually abusing them. We did 2 to 3 hours on each woman, and what I was listening for was how did they cope with it. One of the things I heard time and time again, it seemed like the women who were doing relatively better with some more resiliency, I mean, everybody had been damaged by it, but it was the people who had, I'm thinking of a choir teacher, a choir leader, teachers, a scout leader. There were different authorities, an aunt in one case. It was some attachment figure who was safe, usually outside of the home because there was incest in the home, but there was somebody who believed in that kid and they could talk to, not even necessarily about the trauma, but safe attachment is crucial to survival of stress of all sorts for adults and kids. Okay, now let's talk more in an acute sort of situation where somebody is really revved up and overwhelmed. So if you can, try and just help them notice that you seem like you're really stressed out. Could you take a few slow, deep breaths, depending on your role, if that's appropriate to say. Try and see if there's a way you can give them a little bit of control over the situation, because trauma takes control away from people. If you help them feel more in control and make some choices, it can be helpful. So a teacher might say, do you want to put that assignment aside for a minute and just take a few minutes to kind of calm down or to draw a picture, depending on the kid's age. You can give the kid a little bit of room to help them re-regulate. This is all about regulation of the body and the mind. Grounding, with PTSD, the person may be sliding into the past. They may, even though they're in, let's say, the classroom, they may not really understand fully that I'm in the classroom. It's April 2018. It is not, 2 weeks ago when I saw that horrible fight at home with dad going at mom with a knife. It's not that. They start to feel like it's happening again. They may not be conscious of what they're aware of, but the breathing's getting deeper. They're feeling great dread and threat, and they're starting to do exactly what I'm doing. They're starting to gear up for something scary and hurtful. If you just, what I do as a therapist, and depending on your role, you can maybe help them see, just take a moment, look around, just if you want, like feel your desk. When I'm working with patients, if they have a ring on or a watch, can you just touch that? You want to use all 5 senses. Can you see around the classroom, see where you are, smell, can you smell anything, the eraser, the coffee that you're drinking? What you're trying to do, at least this is the way I figure it, my friend Ruth Lannis hasn't told me I'm doing it wrong, you're trying to get the parts of the brain that have shut down back on. And you use all 5 senses because you want the whole dang brain back on. And I teach patients. I teach them why I'm doing it, and then I have them do it again and again and again because they have a conditioned response to shut down. So grounding is get grounded in the present. So you're here in the classroom with me. You're safe. Look around the room. See who's around with you. See, there's your best friend. Just take a few minutes to do some breathing. You're helping them re-regulate. Same with orienting. I've kind of blended grounding. Grounding is using the senses. Orienting is helping them really recognize they're safe now. And that helps the crocodile brain kind of chill out a little bit and lets the prefrontal cortex come back on. Okay, one of the things I'm trying to do to make information more accessible and easily available to teachers, professors, students is I've developed a teachtrauma.com website. Thank my dean, Terry Cooney of CLA, gave me a little bit of some funding to do this, and I've had students who have helped me with just volunteering on the study. God bless Towson students. We do a lot of powerful stuff on very little money. And so go to this website. We've got all kinds of slideshows from trauma experts, all kinds of classroom activities. I've got to get more because that site, that one page has over 17,000 hits already, and this website's only been up for 3 or 4 years. I need to do a lot more development of the thing, but I teach and research and train, all kinds of stuff. Can't even keep it straight. Okay, here's some good books for anybody who wants to read more about it. These top 2 books are going to have some graphic detail. If you're struggling with your own really serious PTSD, it may not be the time for you to read about those. The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog, for anybody who really wants to know true life stories of kids' trauma and what it has done to them, Bruce Perry is phenomenal. He's like a rock star in the child trauma field. And if any of you were old enough to remember David Koresh and the Branch Davidians fiasco in Waco, Texas, he was the one brought in to treat those traumatized kids who'd been essentially brainwashed by the Branch Davidians. So he gets that level of referral. And he talks about the Branch Davidian kids in one of the chapters, and a whole bunch of other traumatized kids. Judith Herman, that is Trauma and Recovery. She's the first one who really started writing about complex trauma. And I make my grad students read that book, even though it's really old and all the research isn't up to date. She's a brilliant woman and a brilliant writer. And start with the introduction. Don't skip it, students, because that's where she puts out some stuff that's just, I wish once a year I thought like she did. Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps Score, he's one of the first people who started recognizing that the body really remembers and feels trauma. Trauma isn't always remembered the way other memories are. It's not always organized and linear with verbal information stored. It's often somatic. It's often experienced in the body. So somebody who, let's say, was at one point choked, seriously choked, they may start feeling like they're choking again, even though there's nothing touching their neck. That's what's called informally a body memory. Anyway, he writes a book about that that's actually one of Amazon's bestsellers right now. It's a very hot book. It's only been out a couple of years. If anybody's really interested in attachment relationships, Causalino's book is fabulous regarding that. Here's some websites that are really very good. This is the one Frank Putnam and others have put up their PowerPoint slides. I've also got a link to that on my Teach Trauma website. This site is fantastic in terms of having all kinds of training webinars available on there. They're very good webinars about the impact of trauma and how you treat trauma in kids. This is more for, this one down here is more for therapists. Anyway, just some really great resources. That's my email and the Teach Trauma website, if anybody's interested. Thank you.
So each one of us in this audience may have a different takeaway. For me, a person interested in particularly young children, to realize that we often think if they would just try harder, if we just had a better curriculum, if we just spent more time. But the intrusion of this stress and trauma on so many of our children, and particularly children in our urban areas, is so profound in terms of their ability to really make academic progress. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us not to be the expert that Dr. Brand is, but certainly to be aware enough to know that many of these children are precluded from academic progress because of these issues of stress and trauma. And so I want to express my gratitude to you today for helping all of us enhance our knowledge so that we can at least begin in a rudimentary way to identify what it is that may be inhibiting the progress of these children, and then to have experts dig into the experiences they've had, which will negate academic progress for these students, and which will not be remediated simply by being kind or not expecting anything from them without intervention, and the fact that this will be a longitudinal progress, have longitudinal progress, a negative progress in terms of what happens to them and what ultimately happens to our society because of this. So I can't thank you enough for beginning this conversation, for helping us have some rudimentary knowledge of what these children may have experienced, may be experiencing, and what are our obligations. And so please join me again for thanking Dr. Brand. She has willingly said she will stay and answer questions that you may have. There is a microphone here. We would just ask people to come forward if they have a question, and they would certainly welcome her response. I would also like to say that we have videotaped this presentation today. It'll be available on our website here at Towson University, and you can certainly access that in terms of her slides also. So just give us a little bit of time to edit it, and then we will have it available for you. So those who have any questions, she will be the person responding. Thank you.
So anybody who wants to stay, feel free, and we're not going to be offended for all of those who need to get on their way. If there are questions, just please come up to the mic. And I know that's daunting, but look, I dissociated in front of Dr. Chandler. You can come up and ask a question.
I'm going to this mic.
Absolutely. Well, ask so everybody can hear in the mic.
Oh, that one.
Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
I said I'm not going up there.
Yeah.
Hi, how are you? You can go.
What is known about the age of when the trauma occurred? In other words, if it occurs before the age of 5, is there a bigger impact? Or if it occurs when you're a teenager,
So the question is, what do we know in terms of research about the impact of trauma? Does it have different impacts at different ages? And the answer is yes. Are you listening? I know you're trying to get back to your seat. You were brave enough to ask the question. So, okay. That guy, Teicher, that I had a slide on, he's got a series of studies where he looks at different types of trauma at different ages, and he shows that it looks like there's sensitive periods, for example, some teenage years for girls with sexual abuse, where if the sexual abuse occurs then, it may be particularly damaging. We don't have enough longitudinal research on that yet, so the jury's still out, but data is starting to come in that shows that there probably are sensitive periods. Now, let's go back a little bit to very early childhood trauma. Very early trauma, before the kid is even verbal, so let's say ages 2 or so, the child won't have verbal narrative memory and be able to tell you about a trauma, but I've heard some wild cases where a child, I'm going to say a graphic detail for a minute, so if you don't have to listen if you don't want to hear that. A child saw the completed suicide of his father by gunshot, and he played again and again. This was a couple of years later, he showed up in therapy. And in the play therapy room, because he was so young he couldn't do talk therapy yet, he played again and again and again, putting a gun in his mouth and in the therapist's mouth again and again, behavioral reenactment. And then at one point he put the gun in the therapist's mouth and his eyes glazed over. And the therapist said, "What do we see?" And he said, "Pizza." Get it? Pizza. He didn't understand that he was seeing his dad's blown out brains, but he could still see the image in his mind. And at that age, I don't know, 3-ish or so, he was trying to put words to what was wordless. So when people say, "My kid won't remember this, they were too young," don't be so sure. At some level, they may be able to encode it and re-experience it later. So providing a safe environment and teaching them how to regulate themselves and that it's okay to talk about things with safe adults. I mean, these are crucial foundational issues, no matter how young the trauma was, how young the child was at the time of trauma. Yes?
So I'm an educator in Baltimore City, so
Good
I
job.
see a lot of children things with trauma, stress,
Yeah.
definitely abuse. But now, I'm working with children with special needs, specifically autism.
Right.
I'm wondering, is there any research to show are the signs any different for them? Because I have noticed one student who is actually showing some of the glazed over signs that you're displaying, and I thought maybe it was part of his disability, but now I'm thinking it may be this. But I'm wondering, are there any research to show, is there a differentiation between typical peers and children with disabilities?
It is a very good question. I can't think of a study off the top of my head that shows that. I can think of studies that show that kids with various disabilities are at higher risk for being traumatized.
Right.
That much we know.
Right.
But I don't know, and I'm going to explain some of why it is so difficult to do childhood abuse research. People don't, the powers that be don't like to fund, apparently. There's not much money put towards child abuse research. All kinds of things get funded, but in general, across science, funding has gone way down. In the years that I've been at Towson, it's shrunk tremendously. So in the mental health field, it was always underfunded. And then I have a slide I thought about putting it in today. I've got a pie chart, and I just did a quick look at the literature crossing the word treatment with different disorders. Depression had the biggest chunk of the pie in terms of number of studies that had been done with treatment and depression. And then beyond that, I had schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. Those three disorders all have biological causes and medications that treat them. Then there was autism. It was a smaller slice. And then we got to the top of the pie chart. PTSD was much smaller, and dissociative disorders was such a small slice of the pie, it almost didn't exist. So my point in this is that the childhood trauma field has not, we don't have very much research. It's coming out now, but it's not an area that's well funded. So you're asking a very sophisticated question. With kids with autism, has trauma been looked at?
I don't know if you had any background in that. Or I don't
Well,
know.
I don't treat kids at this point, so I don't know very specifically. I don't know of any research that would show it. If you really want to ask somebody who's an expert in childhood trauma, she lives and works across the street. Well, she works across the street. She probably feels like she lives there. Her name is Joyce Silberg. Silberg, S-I-L-B-E-R-G. She's got 2 books on dissociative kids, and I actually just this week referred to her, an autistic boy who's 12 who tested positive for herpes, and it means that he's been sexually abused. And she at least has enough familiarity, she's willing to work with a kid like that.
Yeah.
So Silberg, Shepherd Pratt.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, I'm Liz. I'm a school counselor in Baltimore County. When you're looking at the impact of the brain of a traumatized person,
Yep.
through their healing process, do you see any regeneration or regrowth of those areas that are impacted?
I'm not a neurobiologist, so there's very likely to be all kinds of research I'm not aware of. But I have seen at various conferences there are some studies that show that trauma treatment, including from medications as well as from talk therapy with small sample sizes, it looks like some of these areas that were initially smaller may be able to regenerate. So it looks like some of the healing of the brain literally can be possibly seen, but the sample sizes are very tiny. Yep.
Hi, my name is
Hi.
Nicole. I'm a Towson University student. I have 2 questions. Is that okay?
Sure, absolutely. If you're a student who's got the courage to stand up at the mic, you can ask 3 if you want.
I'm not even like a psychology major or anything. So my first question is that we talked about dissociating as a form of freezing. Are flight and fight also included in reactions to childhood trauma?
Yes, I didn't make that clear. So some kids, when they're feeling threatened, or adults, they go into fight mode. Others try and run away. And those are both really potentially adaptive responses, depends on the situation. But there is that third one that most people don't really know about, freezing.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
And then my second question is, what is the purpose of trauma survivors reenacting their trauma? Like, what does that do for them to cope? Whether it's healthy or unhealthy, what does that do for them?
So you're asking a question that's theoretical that we don't have any hard data to answer, but I'm going to tell you clinically what I think is happening. In a way, it's like them telling in a disguised format what happened to them, that they need the story to be heard and understood, and they don't even typically understand it. That woman I worked with, who was facing actually, Maryland got rid of the death penalty, so she wasn't facing death, but she was facing life in prison. She hadn't made the connection between what she did and what happened to her father. So it's sort of like trauma doesn't forget. It's not to be forgotten. It keeps coming up and coming up and coming up and coming up, like in Macbeth.
Yeah.
out damn spots.
Yeah.
I mean, she kept seeing the blood all over her hands. Like, we can't not remember trauma. It intrudes on our consciousness and in our behavior.
Do we reenact it to help us understand like what happened more? So the more
That's
we
what
see
Freud
it.
initially said. He's one of the first people to talk about this. The compelling urge to master what was uncontrollable early in life. We repeat it, hoping to get it right. Like in abusive relationship after abusive relationship. Of course, what a therapist would try and help somebody do is like, let's stop getting involved with abusive people. Let's start with somebody who can actually offer you what you deserve and need. But that's the idea about why people replicate those patterns in relationships. It's what they know, and it's an attempt to get under control what they couldn't in childhood.
Thank you. I enjoyed
You're
the
welcome.
presentation.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Martin Omley. I'm part of the school psychology graduate program here at Towson.
Great. Yeah.
So I'm here with a couple of other people from my class, and something that was sort of stewing around my head at the end of the presentation was sort of, we as school psychologists really have to, especially in our program, we're very big on understanding why trauma is so important to take into account and how like a student like manifests different types of behaviors and stuff like that, making sure we're not too quick to rush to judgment.
Yep.
But I suppose my sort of question is, I mean, obviously we have a lot of really good teachers in here and people in the educational field who obviously are motivated enough to learn more about trauma and how that might influence their classroom. But as psychologists, when we have to sort of like fight tooth and nail to make sure that like kids are taken care of appropriately, what do we do with teachers who may not have that extra motivation to learn a bit more about this sort of thing, or maybe a bit more resilient to that sort of differential attribution? Because as you were putting it earlier, people are a little bit more likely to attribute like other people's failures and things of that nature to more internal qualities as opposed to external factors and whatnot.
Fundamental attribution error of
Exactly,
social psychology.
exactly. But I suppose my question is like, even just from a personal perspective, like what would you recommend for people working in our side of the field when we have to sort of work with maybe administrators, teachers, other people in the schools who may not either understand or are a bit more resilient to that sort of understanding of how trauma can affect kids?
So I think you actually mean when they're a little bit more resistant, not resilient, right? They're impervious sometimes. And I'm not trying to say anything negative about administrators, but there's hearing about trauma and knowing how common it is painful for all humans. And so we do, to protect ourselves, want to tune it out. I mean, do I want to watch the local news, the national news, and the international news, and see yet more death and violence and all that? No. And I actually teach my patients sometimes turn off the TV. If you're feeling yourself, with one more mass shooting, don't sit there and watch it all day. So I try and balance. I know, I might say something like this if I were in that position. I know you all know I'm going to talk about trauma, and I am. But I'd like to invite us all to be curious. Is there any possible explanation for what's going on, given what we know about Mark's family and what he's dealing with? What can we expect of him when there's so much chaos? And I might just list some of the things, if you know about them. There's so much stress in his family. Is it really that big of a leap to think that he has trouble sitting still and paying attention when his brain is jacked up? When he didn't perhaps sleep well the night before. I just hope all of us can really try and think from a kid's perspective. And then with my students, when I teach about trauma, and actually with juries, I say I would invite you to pay attention if after a while you don't want to listen to me anymore. If it gets too painful and you want to tune me out, because of course you do. We all need to protect ourselves from pain. And hearing about trauma, sometimes, I admit, sometimes it's like, oh, another priest abuse scandal? Really? You just get overloaded with hearing about all the violence in the world. And so I try and normalize it and yet encourage them to also be curious because our kids need us to.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hi.
Hello.
Marty Zimmerman, one of your colleagues here.
Yes. And I get to observe your teaching in a few days, and I'm
Yes.
excited about that.
Hopefully it won't traumatize you. But looking at your comments of the victims of trauma
Yeah.
and pushing away behavior, harming themselves, but as you alluded to with one of the young lady's questions, how much of that is that's giving them the control versus they didn't have any control over the trauma when they were traumatized? So how much of that dynamic is them trying to gain some control by pushing people away. I mean, I saw it in foster kids, you know.
Absolutely.
Not one, you know, what can I do to disrupt the placement because I know it's going to happen.
And so I'll do it first.
Yes.
Before they kick me out and reject me, I will push my sibling down the stairs. That's a foster kid I worked with at one point. I'll just push the other kids down the stairs until I get kicked out. Sometimes they actually take charge and get themselves evicted on purpose. Or the self-harm, same thing. I know somebody else is going to hurt me, I'm going to be the one to hurt me. So what I try and do as a therapist is help people put into words what they're hoping those behaviors are conveying or doing or how it's protecting them, and then try and get them in a non-judgmental way to really look at it. If you keep dealing with it this way, what's your life going to be like, and are you going to be happy?
You're pushing the people that you need. You're really pushing away.
And they'll say, "I don't need you,"
Yeah.
and "I don't need anybody." You
Right.
know what they'll say to you.
I'm a rock. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. See you next week.
Hi, John Warden. I am very intrigued by the ACEs survey.
Yeah.
And in reading the research, they talk about it's supposed to be administered to adults. On my day job, I work with kids and families. And is there a childhood version of the ACEs survey that we can administer to kids?
I'm sure there is, but then you know about the duty to report. And so it opens up a whole potential can of worms. If you're asking kids about, there were 3 questions about abuse on there. So if you ask about that and you get yeses, then what is your duty to report? So although I don't at my fingertips on my laptop at home, I don't have a childhood ACE questionnaire for children. I'm sure it exists, but you just have to think about that. Because then... Okay. If you email me, I'll find you a version.
Okay.
Yep.
I've looked, I couldn't find anything.
Really?
I've talked to other people in the field, they say, oh, no, you can't give the ACE to kids, you gotta do it for...
It may not be validated on kids. That's going to be the issue. And then if you want to publish or actually have it mean something and anybody challenges you, if it's not been validated on kids, it's probably not the best measure. There are trauma exposure questionnaires that have been validated on kids. There are. So the ACE may not be the best way. The ACE questionnaire is great because it's quick and dirty. You can just give it to people and, in 5 minutes you have your data. So you may want to think about one that's standardized. Yeah. Yep.
Hi. So I had a question about misdiagnosis. So I know in some kids they get misdiagnosed for ADD, or they are not diagnosed for ADD if they're spaced out or maybe look like they're dissociating. So do you know how much kids get misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed?
Extraordinarily often.
Mm-hmm.
The students in the clinical focus program that I teach, some of them are out on internships working with kids, and it's amazing. Even though in most of these kids' charts it's well documented that they've been abused and neglected, very rarely is PTSD listed, and almost never a dissociative disorder. And yet they've been so exposed to trauma that they've been removed from the family home. This is one of the reasons why I'm passionate about teaching about this stuff, because even mental health professionals, when I work in forensic cases, I can't tell you how many cases over the years have been sentenced to death, people sentenced to death, and they have horrible trauma histories, and nobody's assessed them for PTSD or dissociative disorder. Are you kidding me? 2018. But yeah, I'm not kidding you. That is exactly, so these cases get re-examined before they're put to death, hopefully, in most cases. So it happens with kids all the time. ADHD or ADD is the most common misdiagnosis. Do you know the other one?
I'm not sure.
They look up and down. Bipolar.
Oh.
Or if they're acting out kids, conduct disorder.
Oh, yeah.
And once a kid's labeled with conduct disorder, they're in trouble because people don't like them and they stop believing in the kid. And the kid's kind of stuck with that diagnosis. So for all you folks out there working with kids, it is so important to consider the impact of, could this be trauma? Not what's wrong with you, what happened to you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good evening. Thank you so much.
My
I'm
pleasure.
Tom Bowser. I'm a principal in Baltimore County. And
Wonderful. Thank you for coming.
Very grateful to be here. We have been working with our staff on trauma, and we actually have almost 3 full-time therapists from the Children Guild in our building that have
Fantastic.
full-time caseloads.
Yeah.
We have waiting lists. So
don't
our
doubt
needs
it.
are great. Working with the faculty, my question to you is, and I know you have all the answers, so thank you so much for
All of
fixing
them.
this.
All of them. You just tell
Is-
my teenagers that, would you?
Well, it's something that I realized that the layers here. So now we're talking to teachers
Yeah.
about how they can work with and identify children with trauma. And as I'm watching and kind of looking at my staff, I'm realizing, wow, I have all these staff that are coming to us with their trauma.
You bet.
And so that really complicates the whole factor of trying to get them to then, because how many of them, we had a faculty meeting last night, and I watched the glaze. And I thought, okay, well, that's where we have to focus. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on how we can try to address that. I don't know.
Well, first of all, I'm in awe as a principal that you have therapists providing treatment for kids, and I'm not shocked in the least that you have a wait list. I wish every school had those kind of resources. As a professor here, I watch the glaze. It doesn't mean everybody's dissociative. It can also just mean that they're really tired and I've been talking too much, and so I try and then change my activity. So it's like, let's get up, let's stand up, let's get them to talk, let's do role plays or something. It's changing levels of arousal. But if I really think a staff member might be dissociated, and remember the stats, depending on the study, 60 to 70% of people have experienced at least one ACE, which means some subset of your staff have had a lot of ACEs. They can be some of the best teachers and guidance counselors or therapists if they're able to regulate themselves and they've managed it and they've worked on their trauma. Otherwise, sometimes it can just muck everything up. So I don't know. I've never been a principal, and I'm just going to talk very idealistically, but it would be fabulous if they had some struggles, if they were allowed to leave to go to therapy somehow during the day, or if they were getting too revved up by a kid, if teachers could take a little break. I don't know how this stuff works in schools. You guys have to tell me that stuff. But we all need to be able to take breaks. I know as a therapist, my patients always laugh. I always have something to drink. At the very least, I can always reach forward and get a drink and regulate myself. And I have nice stuff in my office, tons of plants, usually something flowering, and pretty pictures. If I'm hearing something that's starting to throw me off, I hear horror stories. I work on keeping myself regulated so I can be present and bear witness with the client. So I think of that metaphor, it doesn't happen anymore on airplanes, but it used to. They would say at the beginning of the trip, if you're traveling with a small child and the oxygen mask drops down, breathe yourself first before you help your child. And that's my metaphor. So metaphorically, help your teachers learn to keep themselves regulated so they can regulate the kids. And I do that with my students in training to be therapists. Keep yourself in what's called the window of tolerance. So you're not dissociating down here and you're not jacked up and ready to, fly off the handle and scream at the kids, which I'm not a teacher, but I've had 2 children. I know how hard it is to stay in the window of tolerance. And so I would encourage them to try and do that. Yeah, it's fabulous what you're doing for your staff and your kids. Are we done? Everybody tired? Thank you.